This podcast is hosted by the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, USA, which is about a mile from the former grounds of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. We are working to bring honest interpretations of the Carlisle Indian School that was in operation from 1879 until 1918. We honor the 7,800 Indigenous students from across the United States who came to Carlisle. The Indian School is a significant place of remembrance for our Native peoples. Because of the endurance, strength, and prayers from our people who went to the Carlisle Indian School, many of us are here today. This episode was recorded on July 18th, 2024 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm posting this episode in early December 2024. At the time of this recording, I only knew of 4 relatives who went to the Carlisle Indian School. Now in December, I know of at least 6 relatives who went to Carlisle. Now, let's walk in the footsteps of our Indigenous relatives together. Guatsi Sehopa. This is Dr. Mandy Jeremiah. I am recording this special episode on July 18th, 2024 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's at the end of the day. I'm extremely exhausted, but my mind is constantly thinking about what I learned today. I had the opportunity to tour the Carlisle Barracks, which is the former grounds of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, with my 2 colleagues, Jim Gerenser and Kate, and it was a great opportunity to connect with them and to do a walking tour with them, and some of it was a driving tour. But they are 2 esteemed colleagues who have studied the Indian School, who have went through many, many, many archival records to understand the story of students, to understand the stories of administrators and teachers that went there, understand the stories of the superintendents that were there, and understand how the Bureau of Indian Affairs functioned within the scope of the school, and how the school functioned within the scope of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. My 2 colleagues, Kate and Jim, are just so amazing, and they are non-Indigenous folks who really care about sharing the truthful account of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Now, at the time of this recording, I've only lived here in Carlisle for about 2 months, and I felt that recording this today was significant because I learned a lot touring the barracks with Jim and Kate. And, before I came to Carlisle and living here and taking the job as the executive director for the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples, the first time I came here was in June of 2021. And I came with 2 friends, 2 colleagues, and the 3 of us came and explored, experienced Carlisle, the town, and then also had the opportunity to go to the Carlisle Barracks, which again, of course, is the former grounds of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And when the 3 of us came, we did some research beforehand about some of the significant buildings and, how to access some of the facilities on the Carlisle Barracks campus. And that experience was very different because I didn't have a whole lot of connections here in Carlisle. There was a colleague that I did have a connection to at the Cumberland Historical Society, who helped me gather images and gave me some resources to research further into Louis T. Wanima, who was an Olympian, a student at the school who competed with Jim Thorpe, and he was often in the shadow of Jim Thorpe, but he is from Hopi, Second Mesa. There's so much information that is all over the place about the Carlisle Indian School. And I do want to mention too that in the way that I pronounce Indian, I don't say Indian, I say Indian. I've always pronounced that word as Indian and not Indian. And so that's really important to just understand. And a lot of indigenous relatives I've heard also pronounce it as Indian and not Indian. But as I refer to in my story, today I'm just reflecting about what I learned today in light of what I have learned coming to Carlisle for the first time in 2021. So when me and my colleagues came and explored and just went on the campus, the Carlisle Barracks, we saw buildings that were significant. There are plaques there, different signage that do tell about some of the buildings, because there are actually a handful of buildings that are from the original Indian boarding school days. And but I remember we just really stayed at the main part where the parade route is, which is like the center of campus, which is a huge long field, and it still is there today. And I remember going to these different buildings. We went inside the Jim Thorpe gym and had the opportunity just to walk around and to, look at the architecture. And right now it's a gymnasium, literally, where there are workout machines. There's a track on top on the second floor. But I just remember just walking around and just reading the signs and taking it all in. And the Indian field, of course, was an important part to my journey and my story, because I understood a lot about Tiwanima and his journey at Carlisle. But also, I am a descendant of four relatives that I know of that went to the Carlisle Indian School. It's really interesting to me because I have not really identified as a descendant of the Carlisle Indian School until recently. Like, I knew, for many years actually, that some of my relatives from Laguna Pueblo and from some of our villages, like especially Powati, which is one of the six villages in my community, I knew that our relatives like came to Carlisle, but I didn't necessarily articulate or identify publicly, I guess, as a descendant. But now, as I work as the executive director, I am very vocal and want to center my relatives who went to the Carlisle Indian School and the positionality that I have among being a descendant. I personally feel that I have a responsibility to share their story, to represent them. And like, for example, when I started in May of 2024 in my position, I spent about 2 to 3 hours crafting my email signature. And I connected with my sisters and my mom and asked them for feedback, because I wanted to share in my email signature and honor the relatives that went to the Carlisle Indian School. I have my names. I have all my names. I have many names. But Amanda, Mandy, Royce, Josanna Ray Charamaya, which my full name honors my family, especially my paternal and maternal relatives. And I share my Indian names, Kaltui, which is named after my great grandpa's aunt. So Kaltui is really significant because two of her sons, which would also be my relatives, came to school here. And so Kaltui is really significant, and I'm really honored to have her name. Actually, in our center, I printed out a large photograph of her and is in our conference room because I wanted to honor her. And I feel every time I see her picture, I feel safe and I am grounded to know why I am here. With my relatives having this really close connection, I put the names of the four relatives that I'm a descendant of, and I also put their enrollment date. And I put the enrollment date as well to honor Tiwanima, because I really do feel connected to him. So yeah, and then I also put a land acknowledgement and then my contact info. Also include my Alaska Native name that was given to me by Inupiaq elders in Kotzebue, Alaska, which is on the northwestern part of Alaska of the state, which is above the Arctic Circle. And my Inupiaq name is Sipun, Sippun, which means big guns, like big muscles, like strong. And the reason why I got that name was because I was at an elders conference in Kotzebue in September of 2022, and I was They're helping and carrying food from one place to another, and I carried a big pot of stew, and they were really the elders were really impressed, and, I just did that, because 'cause I'm there to serve the community, to serve the people, and they had given me the name Sipun. So all those names honoring my relatives' names, all of them, I named them and their enrollment date to the Indian school. I put it all in my signature. And I think that's really powerful because as I go about my work here at Dickinson College, people will ask me or people will refer to my email signature and what that means and what my relatives mean to me. And so it's really significant. So I spend a lot of time really crafting and figuring out ways of how to share my story and how to honor my relatives who went to the Carlisle Indian School. But today it was significant to me because I learned a lot about the placement of the buildings and understood a lot of the original floor plan, the landscape of the Carlisle Indian School. Prior to today, I've been to the grounds, the Carlisle Barracks, the former Carlisle Indian School. It's currently the U.S. Army War College, and so there's a long history there too about the Army, using using the grounds for different purposes, and but in particular, I've been to the grounds many, many times, and because the work, my office is only, gosh, it's only about a 5-minute drive, maybe 5 minute or less to the Carlisle Barracks, and it is just a little over a mile. So I am really close in proximity to the Carlisle Barracks. And a lot of times, I'll sometimes just cruise down the road, and when I see the cemetery, I'll just, say "Gowatsu, say Hopa," and then, drive on through on the road, and sometimes I won't, necessarily stop on the campus grounds. Ironically, across the street from where the cemetery is, which is where the main entrance is right now, there is a 2-mile golf course, that sometimes I walk around to. I frequently, either drive by or go into the grounds of the Carlisle Barracks and just be there. I often feel really, connected. I feel empowered, and sometimes it's hard. There's harder days too, for sure, going to the Carlisle Barracks grounds. A couple days ago, here in July, I visited a couple graves. There were two Pima students who are buried in the cemetery, and a few weeks ago, I actually had the opportunity to connect with the Gila River Indian community tribal education department, and I was able to connect with some of their educators and just provide tips and trick strategies to engage with their students, to engage with their families and communities. And I was able to bring back two tribal flags, their tribal flag, and put it down right in front of the gravestone for the two Pima students. Like that is their relatives from the Gila River Indian community. And so I put their flags down a couple days ago, and that was really emotional. From here, from Carlisle to Sacaton, Arizona, which is essentially like the capital of the Gila River Indian community, is over 2,200 miles. And I can only imagine how the students felt when they were here. It's very different climate. Here it's humid, and in Arizona it's like Sacaton is very dry air, very hot. The terrain is different. The mountains are a lot bigger there in that part of the state in Sacaton, which is directly like south of Phoenix, Arizona. I was just thinking about their journey, thinking about how they got here and what happened to them and what happened to their families. So that was an emotional time. But as I got to the barracks today, we did a walking tour, and Kate Dimer who's really closely associated to the Cumberland Historical Society and has done a lot of research. Both her and her husband Jim, they are very knowledgeable about the Carlisle Indian School. They have spent years and years going through the archives and seeing the first account witnesses through writing and through photographs, and they have a lot of knowledge, and I really just respect them and honor them for spending all these years and investing their time into helping these resources become available, especially to descendants like myself. And there are thousands and thousands of visitors that go to the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center webpage, and there is thousands of scans of original documents regarding the Carlisle Indian School, and I found a lot of my descendants' information on there, and that is made available publicly. And so Kate and Jim have done a phenomenal job, and other colleagues, to help scan documents and to put them on the resource site so that researchers and especially descendants, we have access to that information. So when I went to the grounds today with Kate and Jim, I was really curious to see how they would share their perspective and share, the facts about the Carlisle Indian School. And Kate has authored a small booklet that has it's a walking tour booklet that's available at one of the local bookstores here. And she brought one of those books and was using it, of course, as the guide to help me understand and to help me see, especially see the buildings that don't exist anymore. But there's actually a really good number of original buildings that do exist. And where we started the tour was at a part that I'd never been to before, really. Like, or I've been there. It's like Garrison Lane is where, well, we actually even started outside of the grounds, excuse me, like at the original train station. And one thing that's really interesting to me is I'm connecting all these different experiences. And as I live in Carlisle as an Indigenous woman, I it's been fascinating these last couple of months to live in Carlisle. I often find myself in spaces where there are not a whole lot of people. There are 0 people who look like me or carry themselves like me, in the sense of I know that I have a presence, and the way that I dress, the way that I look, my hair color, which is, dark brown, looks black sometimes in different lighting. And I wear a hat, and I wear hats that are very beautiful, very elaborate hats that is made by Thunder Voice Hat Company, which is a Dene Navajo owned business out of California. And I have 2 hats that I typically wear, and they stand out, and I often get comments about my hat. So I have a presence about me when I go about living my life here in Carlisle in present day, as well as, exploring different parts of Pennsylvania. And there's stories that I've heard, and I've heard these stories before, but Kate and Jim mentioned it today. There is, when Pratt brought Indian students to Carlisle on the train, he would bring them oftentimes like at midnight, which is an odd hour because the local Carlisle community would be very interested to see the students come in. And it was as if the Indian students, were spectacles. And it's interesting because now I, as an Indigenous person living in Carlisle, in my opinion, sometimes I feel like a spectacle where people will literally stop me when I'm at Walmart or at Chick-fil-A going through the drive-through or at TJ Maxx. And it's sometimes jarring. People will say, they'll just stop me and they're like, "Are you Indian?" And like this one lady at TJ Maxx, she's like, "Are you Indian? Like, where are you from? How much?" And I was like, buying stuff for my apartment. And I was just like, whoa, like, what is happening right now? And there's another time where I was like buying a mattress for, my new place. And the guy, he just asked me, he was like, "Are you from the plains?" And I was like, "No." I had this shirt that had, the acronym NTVS, which is actually natives, but there's a native company, a clothing company that's NTVS, and so I was wearing that shirt, and it was in big letters, and so just asking me, "Are you from the plains?" I'm like, "No." And then when I was buying the mattress, he was asking me questions about what I thought about Native American mascots, and I don't know. But the point is that I believe, in my opinion, that I have a small glimpse of what our Native relatives may have felt, may have experienced from non-indigenous people here in Carlisle. So yeah, there's a road called Garrison, and that is the road that the students would take in the early days to get to the school. So when I was on the campus, the Carlisle Barracks campus, what stuck out to me are a few things. So the first thing was that I did not realize how many original buildings are still intact. When I, experienced the barracks on my own, when I'd go just by myself or, with family or a few friends, I didn't know that there was so many buildings that are still there. Now, there's a lot of buildings that aren't, but the buildings that are there give you a really good sense of what the buildings that do not exist anymore would have looked like. And so today on my walking tour, there was many buildings that I have passed by, but of course I didn't really know the significance of some of those buildings. And like for example, right where there's the bandstand, which is like in the center of this long grass field, and right next to it there is it would have been the teachers' quarters at the time. And right next to that, like right behind it, is a cottage. And all the times I've been there, I don't think I've ever seen that cottage until today. And that cottage was used for a place where at 1 month at a time, there would be four Indigenous women students, girls there in that house, and would learn a lot of the domestic responsibilities in that type of environment. And this cottage provide a place, I guess, to really use those skills that they have learned at their training while they were at school. And so that's like, for example, that was something new to me that I didn't see or even know existed. But as I walked around the campus with them, I asked them a lot of questions about, what was it like? Like even, and we were talking about this too at different points throughout the day. When did the school get heating, and what was the meal service like? What did students like eat, and what was the portion like? And I'm gonna have them here on the podcast so they could answer some of these questions. I don't want to, of course, project wrong information, but my general sense was that it's very, very complicated history, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And the way that I'm learning and the way that I'm conceptualizing all of this is in light of me, of course, understanding and really internalizing, my indigenous ways of knowing and being, but being introduced to these different facts and being connected to the very footprint of indigenous relatives who went to the Carlisle Indian School really is transcends time, because the past intersects with the present and intersects with the future. And when I'm there walking the grounds, when I was there today, I have this feeling and this, oh gosh, this sense of course, sadness, this sense of pride, and this sense of comfort. It's just all these emotions, and sometimes a little bit of fear too, because I wonder too a lot of times, like, what our students experience there. Like, I learned today that there are a wide variety of experiences, and a lot of it too is based on which superintendent was in his role at the time. And the way that Jim and Kate explained it to me is that it really is looked at as during the Pratt time, Richard Henry Pratt time, and post Pratt time, because Pratt was there for a significant amount of time. He was there for the longest amount of time. And considering how to articulate the history of the boarding school and That was really helpful to help me conceptualize the history of the school. And when I was there, I learned a lot of really interesting facts. Like, one thing I learned was that there was actually a roller no, yeah, there was actually a roller skating rink in, the gym, Thorpe Gym, and that was, like, on the 2nd floor. Students could run it, but they could also roller skate around it, and they told me this one story where there was a descendant where her 2 of her relatives actually met when they were roller skating, and that it was a very romantic story, which I think is really precious, because I think a lot of times too, like, you think about the humor of our indigenous that's within our indigenous communities, and I could just see our native relatives making the best of whatever situation they're in and connecting with one another and laughing and joking with one another as they're having this intertribal experience with all kinds of people from all over the country. I also learned that there was an ice skating rink, and this was later on in the school's history, but there are 2, like, fields in the right now it's on the outskirts of the US, Army Barracks campus, like, there's a fence, like, right near these 2 fields, but the story that was shared with me was that there was water that was let into, like, these 2 fields that kinda have, like, a dip in them, like, it's kinda like a natural bowl of sort, and that the water would freeze and it would become an ice rink, and that the students Carlisle Indian School students had the opportunity to go on the ice rink, and one of the stories is that there was another field that was right next to it, and that the folks from Carlisle, the community, could come and use the ice rink that wasn't necessarily the good ice rink. The good ice rink was, reserved for the Indian school students. So I thought that was really interesting too. I also learned that attached to the Jim Thorpe gym was a bowling alley, which that emerged in the 19 teens and some of the 1910s, like in that teen era. And so I thought that was really fascinating, like a bowling alley. So there are definitely, again, like when you look at the boarding school records for Carlisle, it's important to see which decade you're in, because and Pratt is a very, very complicated man, in my opinion, a complex man, and but at the same time though, he was really a simple man in the sense of, like, his mentality was, in my opinion, of course, was to kill the Indian and save the man, like, that was his philosophy, and he said that one time, and I'll have to ask Jim again, it was, like, where that was actually written down, and but that mentality, though, in my opinion, is, of course, very toxic, and I think is the cause, that mentality really cuts deep, I think, among our indigenous relatives, then and now and in the future. And so with him, though, like it appears to me, like looking even at some of the archival records and from hearing from the archivists, that he was a very confident man. He was very proud man, and that he, in many different instances, really extended care to the Indian students at different points. And see, I think it's really fascinating though. Like and in my opinion, of course, exploited our native relatives too. And the boarding school photography too is also really an interesting pathway to follow. Because John Choate, he is the photographer that captured the before and after images. And I learned today that there are only like really 12 sets of the before and after images among all the hundreds and thousands of photographs that were taken of the school. And but those 12 sets of before and after images are striking. They are marked and are imprinted in the minds and in the books and in the literature not only here in our country, but worldwide. And that photography is very powerful. And Choate and Pratt, they, in my opinion, they were very skilled marketers, whether if it was intentional or not, because those photographs will stand the test of time. And a lot of those photographs were taken when the Indian students arrived, and they're very, very memorable. And I am a photographer, and one of the reasons why I take pictures, one of the reasons why I share my stories like on TikTok or Instagram is because of those photographs that John Choate took in those, especially those early years. And the big, like, student body photographs, those really hit me hard. There's an 1884 photograph where over 300 students are lined up on this big field in front of Pratt's headquarters, like, where he lived, his quarters where he lived, and all these students are lined up in rows, and it's a very militaristic looking photograph. The students look very somber, very sad. It looks very traumatic to me, and a lot of times, like, as I've gone through, the literature too, and even looking at boarding school photography, like, Cho really he through his photographs, had the opportunity to share the story of our indigenous people with his photographs, and the camera wasn't necessarily, especially early on, in the hands of our Indian students. But I did learn today too that as technology developed in terms of camera equipment, that after the 1900s, that students began to have their own cameras and take pictures of other students and take pictures of their experience at Carlisle. So it's really interesting the evolution of photography regarding the Carlisle Indian School. And for me in particular, like that 1884 photograph of the student body, oftentimes, right, our relative stories, our native relative stories were told for them and not necessarily by them, especially in those photographs. But now, as an Indigenous relative, as an Indigenous sister, as an Indigenous professional, I have the opportunity to share my story my way. I'm recording on my iPhone right now. Like, I could take my iPhone, right, and make a story on TikTok or Instagram and post it. For me, like, I really acknowledge the power of storytelling, especially when our native voices were silenced or were muted in some ways. And for many others, I believe that those early on boarding school photos really, really impact us and impact our native communities because it's a representation, in my opinion, of the impact of colonization. And I think that's why those photographs are so powerful, and I think that's why those photographs will, last for many, 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 many years. And when I was, there walking around today too, and I've always wondered where the original cemetery was at the school, and today I saw it, and uh, today it's very you would not even know that there was a cemetery there. And from what I understood today from Jim and Kate was that in the 1920s, around somewhere in the early 1900s, like it was very common for cemeteries to be moved, and so it wasn't uncommon for the cemetery, which was the original cemetery, to be moved in 1927 to the land where the grave sites are right now. And that really hit me, of course, when because I wondered, I looked at maps, but I couldn't really conceptualize, could see for myself where the original cemetery was. But today they showed me, and it was a lot to take in because I believe there was like a flagpole there. Like there's like a small little road right there, and then there's buildings that are in this area. And also where the buildings are now were former buildings that had different buildings that housed some of the industrial work. But that was really, really moving and a lot to take in. Like, of course, anything regarding, the cemetery is really tough sometimes to digest. So yeah, there's a lot to process in regards to the cemetery, and seeing the Indian field is always really comforting to me, because I think about Tiwanima in particular, and I think about how he ran the field and he was there, and I got to see the building. I did not even know that there's this original building there. It's really beautiful, but it used to be it used to be a medical building, and then it transitioned into the athletes building where all the athletes would stay. And as Carlisle is really known for the athletics, of course, and Jim and Kate told me that the athletes would get better food and would have better treatment. And a lot of times they could bend the rules, at the school. But I got to see the building, and now it's actually like a hotel of sorts. It's a place where visitors can come and stay. Field is like right close to that, where the former athletic dorm was of sorts. And I don't know, but the field is always really comforting to me because again, I knew that Tiwanimo was there and that he ran there. And I'll have to do a whole nother episode on Tiwanimo. Like, he's very impactful, and I'll have to invite his clan daughter, Dr. Sheila Nicholas, to share more about his story too. Overall, I just think about the endurance. I think about the diligence. I think about the resilience of our indigenous students. The whole time I was taking the tour, I was thinking about, how did our students process this? How did they conceptualize their educational journey? How did they articulate that to one another, right? Or how did they pray, like how were they able to pray, and for them to be able to speak their language and to, pray how they would want to. How did they do that? And I imagine some of it, of course, was in secret because in the Pratt era, like a lot of the students had to essentially like choose a denomination to participate in. And then on Sundays, there would be like a chapel of sorts where it was like non-denominational and all the students had to attend. And but I do think a lot about, their languages. There were so many Indian students that went there over the years, and, there were some, it just varies. There were some that had really bad experiences, there were some that were positive, and everywhere in between. I would try to keep in mind the student's perspective because I really care about students and I care about our Indian people. And from how I was processing things today, in the sense of these Indian students our relatives came from all over the place. And, they're in this system that was not, in my opinion, designed for them. Like Pratt had this system that was not designed for our indigenous people. And it was a very Western way of thinking, a very individualistic way of thinking. And our Indian students often came from communities with a collectivistic approach to life where everything is involved with the community and other people and relatives, and then to go to a place where that wasn't the case. I could imagine the tension, that the internal conflict that students had about adopting new values, or how do you manage that in light of being at this Indian school, which for some were hundreds of thousands of miles away from their original community, their home community. And so I was thinking about that today, and a lot of times too, like even within higher education today in 2024, right? Like a lot of these, in my opinion, a lot of these institutions of higher learning were not designed for our Indian people. So a lot of our Indian students oftentimes will experience, similar things, like they're, coming from these communities and ways of knowing on their homelands or being connected to their homelands in different ways. And there's this tension that happens because in these higher education learning places, there's this tension of Western ways of knowing a lot of times. And what's really exciting though is to see how the tribal colleges and universities are developing and how they're really serving our indigenous communities in different ways and embracing cultural ways of knowing and being, which is really powerful to see. So I think that's really encouraging as we look at the field of higher education. Overall, it was a lot to process, and I'm connecting a lot of the dots for me, and being here in Carlisle is still really it's a lot to live here in Carlisle in present day. And especially, like I'm by myself. I don't have any kids. I don't have any family here. And at this time I'm recording this, I'm hopeful that, that'll change. There's a lot of friends that I've made at the college, which is really cool. And a lot of folks have invited me over for, to have a meal or just to connect and different meetings where I got to meet other people on campus. And so I really appreciate that. And folks are really intentional about helping to, just welcoming me to this place. One really eye-opening aspect of living here in Carlisle is I was really shocked, and I'm still shocked, about how nice people are. How nice people are at the college, how nice people are in the community. People are really gracious to me. Now, people are really curious about me, but people overall, though, I've had very nice experiences, and a lot of people will comment on my jewelry or comment on my hat and comment how I look. And like for instance, a couple days ago I was at a gas station. It's called Sheets. It's a local gas station. It's SHEETZ. And I was, getting ginger ale, and I was checking out, and I had my hat on and a dress and my jewelry, and the clerk was like, "You look really nice today." And I just laughed. I was like, "Thank you." And so I have a lot of experiences like that. Of course, experiences like that, those positive ones really help build my confidence. And yeah, it's a very, very, very interesting place to be in present day, 2024. But I felt that I wanted to come on and to share my experiences today, to share how I'm processing what I learned today in this time, because I think it's sacred knowledge. It's my story from my perspective. Again, I'm not speaking for all of Indigenous America. This is just my perspective and my opinion. And I think it's important to document that. I think it's important to also honor those. Like, I really honor Kate and Jim because they spent hours and hours today helping me connect, helping me understand more about our indigenous relatives, helping me understand more about even just the landscape of the Carlisle Indian School. The campus, I mean, now present day, like there's a lot of buildings on there, and it's a in my opinion, it's a pretty big campus, and I'll have to look up like how many acres it is right now. But in the boarding school photographs, the Carlisle boarding school photographs, like everything seems so spread apart. But as I was situating myself with the different buildings today, I was like, wow, everything is pretty close. And the most jarring part to me is that Pratt's quarters, the house he lived in, and that's where the superintendent lived in, even after Pratt, they really could surveillance the grounds. And that is what's jarring to me because it's like the control, right? The aspect of control was there. And I don't know, it bothers me. And a lot of those, of course, those early photographs too bother me when I see Pratt and he just has this surveillance gaze looking at the Indian students. And it bothers me because again, it's the school, but it also again is just so much bigger. Like it's the representation of how many, 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 many of in my opinion, of our indigenous relatives were surveillanced, were put in these systems to embrace other value systems and to not necessarily always have the opportunity to celebrate and to share and to live out their native cultural ways, especially in education. All in all, very complex. And again, this is my opinion. This is how I'm perceiving things, how I'm understanding things. And one thing I really appreciate about my job is that every single day, literally, I am learning something new about the Indian school. I'm learning something new about something in the archives, learning facts. Yesterday, I was actually at the Cumberland Historical Society with Kate, and I was looking through one box of photographs, and it was the John Choate postcards. They're literally like postcards. Maybe I don't know. So they range in different sizes. The ones I was looking at, give or take, was like a 4x6. They are postcards that the Indian school, original postcards that the Indian school had, that would either give out or sell to the public or create these propaganda cards essentially with our Indian relatives on it. And I just went through there and I was going through these photographs. And as I'm going through them, I'm just like, God damn, like these students, they look like, my relatives back home. They look like my brothers and sisters. Like I just, gosh, it just hits me so hard. But I'm going through them and sorting through them and just trying to understand why this happened and understand the posing even, or how John Choate tactfully curated these photographs and what props were used. And it was interesting too because there were some times, and again I have to ask Jim and Kate like when these different times happened, but even the students, like they had the opportunity to kind of play costume, so to speak. Like I think about it like in nowadays, right? Like if you're at a New Year's Eve like celebration or birthday party, sometimes you have these, photo booths where you have like props or you have glasses or boas or just signs or whatever, and you can take these fun photographs of each other or of your friends. And so I think about it like that, like where there are opportunities for the students to play with the props or to, use some of these objects that were there. And they have these photographs like of them that are not representative of their own tribal communities, but it was them themselves, the student, curating their own photographs and what they wanted to do. I thought that was a really cool story too, because again, I think about the humor. I think about how they connected with one another, and I know our Indian students now, like in education, like a lot of times there are, these really strong connections that are formed and that there are really great times. And so I'd imagine that, our students, especially like for those that I'm sure there's a lot of students who were like introverted and had a really hard time. And there's those that are really extroverted and made a lot of friends and connected. I just know that our Indian people like are very strong people and have endured for so long and will continue to endure. But not only endure, but to thrive in these different learning spaces and these different opportunities to connect with non-Indigenous people in particular. So, with all of that, again, it's a lot to process, a lot to think about, but I just want to share how I am thinking about this content, and especially like the archives, like thinking about the archives. When I say content, I think about that like archives, the research, but then the lived experiences and literally walking in the footprints of our Indigenous relatives who went to the Carlisle Indian School. So with that, I thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes about my experience, the experience of others. So thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Many thanks to Jim Gerenser and Kate Timer for their friendship and their mentorship and always sharing their knowledge with me. Many thanks to Brenda Landis for teaching me the technical process of producing a podcast. Learn more about the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples at dickinson.edu/CFNP. Follow us on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X at CFNP Dickinson. Authenticity is important. You can also learn more about me at amandacharmaya.com, and you spell my last name CHEROMIAH. You can also connect with me on TikTok, Instagram, and X at drchairmaya. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. You can also email me at CHEROMIA@dickinson.edu. And I honor my relatives who came to the Carlisle Indian School. Because of them, I am here. And in the words of Chief Philip Whiteman Jr. from Northern Cheyenne and a descendant from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, he says, "I love you and there is nothing you can do about it." Hashjame Gume Dawai, thank you so much for listening, relatives. Until next time.